I've never
But
seen
I've
it.
seen it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jay Saper Sidney. I am one of the officers for Newton North's Gender and Sexuality Alliance. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a current senior.
Hi, my name is Aviva. I'm a sophomore, and I use they, them pronouns.
My name is Lillian. I'm also a sophomore, and I also use they, them pronouns.
Thank you also very much for being here today. This is a presentation on teenage activism and how people like us who may not have the resources, both financial, time, and transportation, have the ability to support the LGBTQ plus community in our fights for liberation from forms of oppression that we face. So, let's get started. What is good activism? So, good activism consists of listening to, consulting, and uplifting people and their voices, and specifically the LGBTQ plus community. Activism that is good needs to center those who are being helped, not those doing the helping.
A word you're going to hear thrown out a lot during this speech is performative activism. So, performative activism will center the self, or is done for someone's personal gain. Someone might not truly care about the issue, or they might do the activism just because other people are doing it, or they might only speak on topics for the sake of popularity. So real activism will center the voices of LGBTQ plus people, or the group that you're doing the activism for. It will engage in discussion instead of discourse, and it is done out of genuine concern or care for the issue.
Some examples of performative activism are infographics, speaking over others, and centering non-LGBTQ plus voices. Reposting infographics on Instagram are important to spread the word, but make sure your activism does not stop there. And when discussing LGBTQ plus issues, make sure you're not taking too much airtime. Listen more than you talk, especially when discussing LGBTQ plus issues with other LGBTQ plus people. It's important to make sure people who have experiences with the issue are the ones primarily talking about it.
So here's some examples of real activism. We have volunteering, research organizations on your own that are affecting real change and help out. You don't need to volunteer, you don't need to spend time, you don't need to spend money, but your time is also a resource that you have at your disposal. There's also standing up. As we discussed in our B-Block panel, which is on YouTube, if you guys weren't able to attend, if you see a microaggression or something similar occurring, say something, talk to administrator, pull that person aside, explain why what they said is hurtful or discriminatory or derogatory. There's also civic engagement, reporting anti-LGBTQ plus speech to administration, talking to the administration about improving conditions for LGBTQ plus students within North, volunteering and spending your time on political campaigns to ensure that LGBTQ plus friendly candidates are elected to office are all important pieces of civic engagement that we as teenagers have the ability to do. Then, of course, there's also donations. We know we're all teenagers, none of us have money. And so one of the most important things to do is take whatever you have and decide if that's what you want to spend it on, is if you want to donate to the organizations that you may be volunteering for, or talk to your parents or a trusted adult that you know have access to the abilities to donate money and donate resources that they may have to LGBTQ plus organizations and members of the community. And finally, there's protesting. And so if there's a protest going on that you're able to attend it. We'll get more into how to protest safely later, and there's plenty of resources that you guys can look up on the internet. But protesting is just as vital as everything else that we're doing.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about how to be a good activist. So, engaging in discussions. So, engaging in discussions the right way is all about listening more than you are speaking, especially if you're not LGBTQ plus, or you just aren't well versed in the subject matter, which is fine. That's why you're still in the discussion. It's okay to not know everything. Discussions are an opportunity to learn and grow and hear from people that have these experiences. You should really, really try to take the time and understand what other people are saying. Their opinions or their experiences might be different from what you know or what you can relate to, but that doesn't mean you should stop trying to understand them.
What is discourse? In the context of LGBTQ plus issues, discourse and arguments about people's identities or similar things. Discourse also often includes people getting angry. How can it be avoided? When you see discourse, simply don't engage with it. It's not necessary to participate in every conversation, especially if the conversation is destructive. Though it can be tempting to get involved and defend your opinion, the best thing to do is walk away.
Now let's talk about the right resources to share. It is especially important when engaging in activism to find resources that are reliable and trustworthy, especially when it has to do with donations and information. We live in an information overload. We live in an age where someone can post something to Instagram, it will spread like wildfire, even if there's no credibility to their actual post. So it is vital to be able to do the research behind everything that you're seeing. Verify sources, verify information, statistics, and infographics to make sure that they're trustworthy, and check other sites. It's always good to double check. It's always good to cross-reference something that you might see on the Human Rights Campaign's website with the GLAAD website's website, the GLAAD organization's website, sorry. And if you do find a reliable source, always make sure to give it credit. Something I see a lot is on, especially Instagram infographics, maybe sometimes Facebook, and people just in conversation will sort of throw things out there. They'll throw out information, they'll throw out a statistic, and they won't credit where it's from, so it's very hard to prove exactly what you're trying to say, and it's very difficult to fact check. It's also great just because you're not stealing information, and that's always a good thing to do. I can take this one. So a good resource is run by LGBTQ plus people, it's verified by multiple sources, and it's transparent. It's always better to have a member of our community talking about our issues than an outsider, and so that's why it's important to have someone who is LGBTQ plus talking about the issues. It's even better if it is more, if it is a more of a subculture and a subsection than that. So for example, a transgender person talking about transgender issues, a queer person talking about queer issues, a bi person talking about bi issues. Again, as I said, verified by multiple sources. It's vital to have that level of cross-pollination. It's vital to have that ability to say, this has been corroborated by 5 or 6 different places. And it's also transparent. Sometimes you'll see a credible news source also just pulls a statistic up and doesn't give credit to the original scientific study or survey that it's drawing from. And so being transparent about both the amount of money that's coming into the company, into the organization, seeing who their donors are, and also seeing where they're getting their information is just as important as the site itself.
So now we're going to talk about on how to protest safely. So protests are really, really important to any civil rights movement. If you look at any civil rights movement in history, I will assure you, you can find multiple protests. So LGBTQ plus rights are no exception. We have had our very good fair share of protests. So talking more about protests safely. So protests can be dangerous even if they are not violent. So even if you are, like any age, you have to remember like really good key things. So number 1, you're there to support whatever group is being targeted. So yeah. If you are not an organizer, you should be listening to what everyone else is saying, because if you just start saying, hey, we should like go move over there, obviously if you're not an organizer, you don't know what's supposed to happen. You never ever instigate violence with anyone else. Protests are meant to be a safe, non-violent, they're not supposed to be a conflict. They're supposed to be there to show how many people are in support of this issue. And then just, general things. These are also kind of just like concert rules. Bring water and other stuff like that, food, first aid supplies, all that kind of thing. Travel with someone. Don't go to protests alone. That's a really stupid idea. Even if this is going to be a totally safe protest, crowds are very scary, and you can still get lost, even if you are very tall.
All right. What is microactivism? Microactivism is activism on a smaller scale, such as speaking out against microaggressions when you see them and explaining why they're an issue. People will be more inclined to understand and not repeat their words or behaviors if they know what they've done wrong. Reporting anti-LGBTQ+ events to the appropriate authorities. Being supportive towards your LGBTQ+ friends and peers. Calling out anti-LGBTQ+ things to your friends, not to your friends, things your friends or peers might say.
All right, so that concludes the presentation portion of this event. If you guys see up here, we have a QR code for anybody to scan to fill out a Google form to collect your questions, and we will answer them in whatever fashion. So yeah, I'm gonna freeze this so it's up here still. Nope, gotta go that way. Sweet. And let's do this. All right, let's get started. So one of the questions is, can you elaborate on discourse? Sure. So discourse within the queer community is one of the most annoying things to deal with. As someone who's been out since I was 13, I've had to deal with ridiculous conflicts, such as, for no reason whatsoever, people getting very angry about the difference between bisexual people and pansexual people, and arguing ferociously that one is a subsection of another. It's essentially semantic debates that have no real impact on the community. One of the most important things to remember about discourse is that the people who are starting it usually don't actually want to see positive change come from it. It's much more often used as a tool to just sort of divide a community further. And it's very effective at that. It's very engaging and enthralling to get sucked into discourse. I've done it. It's very easy to get sucked in, and that's what it's designed to do.
I'm just going to give some more examples on stuff that's been discourse. There is tons of discourse about something that you might see in popular media called queerbaiting, which is a whole other thing, but it's basically when individuals or companies or media in any kind will kind of insinuate and hint at the possibility of a person or thing being somehow queer or trans or whatever, and it's not ever confirmed, but it is most likely a, marketing thing. So some examples are, like, there's tons of queerbaiting discourse about Harry Styles. It doesn't really matter, but, it's there. Yeah.
All right, so we have another one, which is, can you recommend some resources/websites for people who want to help? Sure. Most prolific one would be the Human Rights Campaign, and also glaad.com, .org. Both of those are very good national organizations. There's also, of course, the Trevor Project. And beyond that, that is the extent of the three main organizations where my knowledge ends. Do you guys know of any more? Cool. The best thing to do is just Google and do your own research. Find issues that you either have a personal connection to, whether a friend might be facing homelessness due to being queer in some capacity. Maybe a friend is transgender and has that as a big part of their life. But do the research and find the issues that really matter to you, and then from there, try and find the organizations that do the most work. One recommendation I have is to try and avoid, as much as possible, the very big, very, very global or national organizations. The Human Rights Campaign and GLAAD do a lot with small organizations as well, and the Trevor Project has across the board done a lot of stuff. But other than that, I really wouldn't recommend going for very, very big organizations because they tend to broaden and constrict who they're able to help. And so donating to smaller local organizations, I unfortunately don't know of any in Newton, but I do know for a fact that there are plenty in Boston to look up and to do your research and to volunteer your time and donations to. But finding more localized organizations will always have more of an impact on the lives in those communities rather than at a national, international, or whatever regional level. Oh boy, all right, let's keep going. Here. Can you talk about experiencing homophobia from another member of the LGBTQ plus community? Sure. Do you wanna do this?
Okay. Experiencing homophobia or transphobia from your fellow LGBTQ plus members is definitely a huge thing that needs to be talked about a whole lot more, because it's kind of seen as like, I can't believe someone would ever do that to you. They also identify kind of similarly to you. They would never. But like, there is a lot of like biphobia, like bisexual phobia in the queer community itself as well. It's one of the bigger ones. But I'm personally, I have only experienced like homophobia online by like people who don't really know me like personally, like on a different level. But I do know that like it's very harmful to like talk about like your queer friends behind their backs about like their gender identity or their sexual identity. It is very like invalidating as well. Like I feel like telling someone that like oh, you're not a lesbian or you're not like really gay, are you? Like I feel like that's when you yourself identify with the LGBTQ plus community and you tear other people down who are in your community, it's like the one bad apple that ruins the bunch, and like it makes everyone else see everyone the same way. Like, oh, there was one person who was extremely rude and tore down everyone else in the community, so everyone must be like that.
Yeah, that sums up a lot of the stuff very well. There's also a lot of transphobia. As a non-binary person, I've seen a bunch of people sort of invalidate my gender identity and my gender expression. I present relatively masculinely, but I've still seen people just completely disregard that, and it's sometimes demoralizing to have that level of disrespect within your own community from people who you would expect to be very much a support. Do you want to say something? Yeah.
There's also a ton of homophobia to lesbians in the LGBTQ community, which is really funny because we're the first letter. But it's so disheartening to literally be the first letter and to still have people like hate you. There's a lot of stuff from that also comes from how sexualized lesbians are in modern media.
All right, so we've gotten a lot of questions about protests, so I'm going to try and answer as many of those as possible. So are there any protests in the near future in Boston? I do know of one, which is the Lesbian March. So Boston Pride, a quick little history. Boston Pride, who typically organized Pride events, was disbanded over the pandemic due to a lot of issues that have been underlying in the committee and in the planners that very much came to a head last year. And so there's no longer that big organization, so Government Square is not going to be filled with what it usually is, with the stage with drag queens and all of the different vendors and stuff. It's not going to have the huge parade as it normally does. However, I do know that there is a Lesbian Pride March planned for June, I believe June 13th, maybe 15th. I'm not entirely sure. If you just Google Boston Lesbian Pride March, you should be able to find it. And so that's the only one that I know of at the moment that's upcoming for a protest in some capacity. Let's also go into quickly how to tell when a protest has gone from safe to unsafe. Oh boy, that's a very good question. If you feel unsafe at a protest, leave. You are there to support the community. You are there to show your support, and you are there to take part in civil disobedience. If you feel unsafe, that is more important. If you do not feel comfortable, if you feel like something might happen, if you see that there are a lot of police in riot gear, or if just people are starting to get more aggressive, or if you're feeling claustrophobic, just leave. No one's going to fault you for leaving. No one's going to call you a bad ally or a bad activist. Your safety is more important than being at a protest. And so there are typical signs of when a protest goes from safe to unsafe, and that's very much police start showing up in riot gear, people start getting more and more aggressive and start screaming a little bit more. Typically, it also happens closer and closer towards nightfall, especially if people remember back in the protests over George Floyd's murder, there was quite a lot of protests that ended up violent simply as time continued to get towards night, and as it approached dark, police would start to tell people to disperse, people wouldn't. Violence. Not condemning or condoning either side, and simply just explaining the fact that that happened. And so looking for those telltale signs of an increase in militant presence, an increase in aggression, is a good litmus test for when it's starting to get unsafe. But again, if you're feeling unsafe, if you don't feel comfortable in the context of if you feel physically unsafe, it should always be a more mentally uncomfortable place to be at a protest, as if you're comfortable with civil disobedience over somebody else's oppression. Not sure that's a great thing. But if you're starting to feel physically unsafe, it is perfectly fine to leave.
So I saw a pretty important one, seeing as that we are in a school. So what to do if microaggressions are coming from a teacher or staff member? This is really not necessarily a hard question to answer, but it's a hard issue to face because it's happened to. I think we've all had experiences with that because it's sadly more common than you think, even in a place as progressive as Newton. So the first thing I would probably say is if you have someone that is also a teacher or just literally a staff member at this school that you feel comfortable with, that you trust, any of those things, just go and tell them, and they will bring it to people higher in the administration that can do stuff about it. I'd also say if it is happening very frequently, I would try to get a record of it, whether that be like a voice memo on your phone, a screenshot of something. Just having a physical record of it is really important, especially if it is continuing to happen.
Continuing on what Aviva is saying, try not to engage with the staff member because that will most likely make it worse. Getting more people to be witnesses of it is especially a bigger thing, as well as getting physical evidence. But the major thing is try not to engage and make things more aggressive towards them. Definitely try and tell a higher up, their boss or someone, or tell another teacher who you feel a very strong connection with and you know that they'll side with you and try and help you.
Another thing is most teachers at North, at least from my experience, are genuinely trying. There are, of course, going to be some who will not do that and who will not put in the effort to be an ally and a supporter of your identity and who you are. I personally have had some teachers who have messed up my pronouns, and I just send them an email or I pull them aside after class or just correct them in the middle of class when they're speaking. And it usually isn't a problem. And so if a teacher's committing microaggressions, letting them know is probably the best thing to get it resolved. If it continues, like Aviva said, just get the administration involved in whatever way you can, get some physical, some form of proof. Yeah, there's also, somebody asked what to do if discourse is coming from a staff member or teacher. I would say take largely the same steps. The line between discourse and microaggressions is very thin because both are invalidating to somebody's identity. And so basically saying to a staff member, hey, maybe don't question if I'm actually pan when I say I'm pan, or bi if I say I'm bi, or don't question my gender identity when I've told you what it is or what my pronouns are. Don't go down that route. It's largely the same thing, especially even if it is a teacher who is queer themselves, simply because it's still a sign of respect, and it is respectful to treat other people how they ask to be treated, as long as it's not without or within reason. Okay. This one? Microaggression? Yeah. Okay, so how can I be sure I'm not presenting microaggressions to my friends who I don't want to hurt? That is a very good question. Communication. That is how you do this. I myself have messed up pronouns of my friends before. I myself have had to learn a great many things about different labels, different identities, different orientations. Just check in with them. Say, hey, are you good? I don't know if what I just said was, offensive or made you feel uncomfortable. I just want to make sure we're okay. And also building that level of trust and connection with somebody else and say, listen, if I say something, just correct me. Just flat out stop me, explain what's going on, and I'll stop. If you can build that level of trust with your friends, and chances are, if you're friends, they're going to want to continue that friendship with you. They're going to want to continue that relationship, and they're willing to put in the effort and that 5-second, hey, don't continue saying that. They are really not going to have much of a what's the word I'm looking for? A disdain from telling you that you're doing something that's offending them. All right, let's go on to, can celebrations such as pride parades be considered activism? Yes.
Yeah, they're definitely a very different form of activism, but they are certainly still activism. They're a little bit less, lobbying for change, but even just going to a pride parade and just celebrating with everyone is a huge thing for allies, and it really feels really, really good as a member of the LGBTQ plus community to see, my straight parents or my, straight friends or family members or any of this. Like, it's not only is it like validating, it also shows that you're willing to like go out of your way to do something and not only be like accepting, be celebratory about stuff. But yes, it is still certainly a form of activism.
All right, so then there are two more that are going to be lumped together. What are some ways that you can safely stand up to and recognize microaggressions? And what can you say to someone in a situation where microaggressions are happening? They're both relatively similar things. You can safely stand up to someone who's committing a microaggression or saying something or perpetuating discourse or something that's just not respectful by saying, hey, maybe don't do that, and explaining why. You don't need to have a great knowledge of the subject. You can kind of just say, hey, what you said was kind of offensive. If you're curious to know why, look it up on Google. One thing that people often get confused is that queer people and people of a marginalized community are not encyclopedias. We are not Google. We are not experts in our field. We are members of a community. We have to, by that metric, we have to force ourselves to learn more and be able to have a more in-depth knowledge of our own struggles, of our own discrimination, but we don't know everything. no one's expecting us to know everything. It's okay to not know everything. It's okay to just say, I don't know. Look it up. Because we have these wonderful things in our pockets called phones. And you guys can just look it up on Google or whatever search engine you use and figure out exactly why what you just said might be offensive or might make somebody else uncomfortable. And in a friend group, specifically pulling them aside afterwards, or if it's a very close group of friends, kind of just saying, hey, don't, is perfectly fine. But if it's a more bigger group of friends or you're not as close to someone, just pull them aside, send them a text afterwards, or worst comes to worst, send them an email, if anybody here checks their emails anymore, other than Winston's updates every week. Just having that level of communication is the best way to deal with it within a friend group, and with people that you may or may not be super close with.
Along those lines, if you don't feel comfortable directly saying it to someone, even in a text or an email, if you know someone who, like, this situation is really good, if it's like a friend of a friend, you can tell that friend, hey, this person said something that, made me feel uncomfortable, or was like, I recognized it as a microaggression, and you can have that person tell them for you. And that can be a lot less scary, especially if you're not out to that person. And it's, especially if that person's like really aggressive about it, it can be a little bit safer.
All right, let's keep going. If someone wants to attend a protest but doesn't have a friend to go with, is there a way to find someone to be their buddy at the protest? Seems like needing to have a buddy would mean some people couldn't participate. Yeah. Ask. If you're if you want to go to a protest and you don't really have a friend who wants to go, maybe a post to your Instagram, hey, I'm planning on going to this protest. I'd like to go with somebody else to make sure we're safe. Is anybody else planning on going? Is there a group I can attend with? Another thing is if a friend doesn't want to go, and this is very much if you just can't find somebody else, share your location with them and set up a plan to text them maybe every half hour or every hour, just to make sure that they know that you're safe, so that you can let them know, all right, I've arrived, I'm here, 20 minutes later, I'm still good, this is what's going on, and then let them know when you're leaving. And that's just if you can't find a buddy, but chances are, we live in a very socially active place, we live in a very social justice-oriented school. Chances are there'll be somebody else that you know, somebody else in your grade going to a protest that's going on in Boston or Providence or Newton, and so you should be able to find somebody within the North community that's actually planning on attending with you. Now can you talk about rainbow washing during Pride Month? Sure.
So rainbow washing is a term that is kind of akin to queerbaiting, but a little bit different. So this is mostly used by corporations or companies. So an example of rainbow washing is basically like the most common thing is as soon as it hits June 1st, all the companies change like their logo on Twitter to be like the rainbow version. And then as soon as it hits, July 1st, they switch it right back. And like a lot of the time, companies will do like, oh, we're running at this sale, or we're, doing this thing, or like, 5% of the proceeds go to X organization. And while that's, all well and good, it's not really real activism, like we talked about. It's performative activism. They're doing it because these large corporations, in today's culture, there will be like serious backlash if like a big corporation like Target or like Apple or any of those don't do something. So they're not doing something for the sake of what they're doing and that it matters to them. They're doing it for the sake of, well, we gotta do something. It's June. Come on, guys.
Another big example of this is when Skittles took away the color and they said the only rainbow that should matter this month is queer people. And again, I feel like speaking on what Aviva said is they're only doing it for either like popularity or... Yeah. If you couldn't hear, we said no one asked Skittles to do that. Like, they're really only doing it for, like, public image and to not, like, make them seem like, if we don't do something, we don't care. Like, you do. You just don't have to, like, make it that big.
Yeah. A good way to tell if a company is engaging in rainbow washing or not is seeing what they're planning on doing as a part of Pride Month. You know, pretty much every company changes their logo to have some form of rainbow in it during June. But the thing that you need to look out for is if they're doing any big organizations, donations to big organizations, or if they're doing a lot of work with local groups. Something that some organizations do is they do giant, like 30% of all profits for the month of June go to an organization, which is great, and it's actually very helpful, and that shows that they're genuinely supporting the community. And then you have the Target Pride Collection, which it's better this year. I'm actually wearing socks from it right now, but it's a bit of a form of capitalizing off of people's identities, which, depending on the company, can feel very uncomfortable. Target does some with queer organizations, but not enough.
Also, a really big way to tell is if they are doing something with their employees that are LGBTQ+. That is, that just really shows that they care about it within their organization and within their company, and not just, you know, the face of the company or whatever. But yeah, the Target Pride collection is actually okay this year. I mean, like, it's not awful, but you know.
Yeah, this year they put like a whole bunch of the people who helped design it on the boards. If anybody's been to the Target in Watertown, they have like all the people who helped design the Pride collection this year are like listed in the section. So that's actually kind of cool. Okay, let's do this one. What are some sites that work at fact-checking to ensure people are getting factual information? Okay, this is getting back to what people might know from their history classes and their English papers, which is checking source bias. My personal favorite site is Media Bias Fact Checker, exactly as spelled, exactly as sounds. It's a great website. It basically, you just type in any organization, any site, and it will tell you the relative reliability and trustworthiness of that site. This works very well for news sites. For organizations, it can be a little more tough, specifically because I don't know if anybody here watches cable anymore. I don't, but I watch YouTube sometimes, and sometimes you'll see ads like Americans Against Soda Tax, for example, and it shows all the negative effects of a soda tax, but in reality, it's paid for by Coca-Cola and Pepsi, who don't want to have their goods taxed, and it's a process called astroturfing. You guys can look it up later. It sounds fun. It sounds just like the artificial turf, but it's not fun. It's actually very damaging. And so, being able to detect if a company is astroturf or if it's actually legitimate is a lot harder. There are good people out there doing the work. ProPublica is a good news site that's trying to figure out if organizations are good or not. But unfortunately, figuring out if an organization is legitimately trying to help a group or if it's paid for by corporations is very difficult. The real only suggestion I have for that is look at their Wikipedia site. You can do this a lot with voting issues and specifically ballot box issues. You can see who the major donors are to each side and to each campaign. That's pretty much the only real way you can sort of see who's donating what. It's by no means a full list. It's by no means reliable. There's a lot of black money that comes in that's just untraceable. But that's the best way I know of to actually figure out if an organization is legitimate in terms of its donation and funders. Okay, this one? Sure.
So someone asked to speak more about the fetishization or the over-sexualization of certain identities. So one of the, I think like the three big ones are the sexualization of lesbians, bisexual people, and trans individuals, which I won't speak much about the last one because I am not trans. But I can definitely speak a ton about the lesbian part. I wrote my sophomore speech on it. Okay, so basically, a lot of people, especially cis straight men, not all, but there's a large majority of you, will view certain identities, especially lesbian identities, as merely something for their sexual gratification. And that's where you get, a ton of comments like, oh, that's hot, or can I watch, or like stuff like that. It's really gross and unnecessary, and like you're probably just gonna get flipped off by a bunch of lesbians. So when it comes to bisexual people, there's it has to do a lot with this sort of bias that bisexual people are more likely to cheat on a partner, and there's tons of stuff out there for that. I don't know as much on it as I am not bisexual. Are you? Oh, okay, yeah.
All right. I am bisexual, so I can definitely be speaking on this one. The biggest thing that pops up when like someone, especially when bisexual women like tell like some straight man, they're like, oh, I'm like bisexual or something, they'd be like, oh, that means like we can have like more people involved, right? No. Like a lot of people like fetishize bisexual women to be like, they just like want to, I don't know, like it's like sexual desires for like everyone at this point, like so it doesn't really matter, like we can have like so many people involved and stuff, and it's just no. And another big thing is when someone says like, oh, I'm bisexual, it's like, okay, you've only dated men or you've only dated women, so are you really? Like just because someone has only had experience dating one gender does not mean that they still don't like the other genders. Okay, that's another really big thing that needs to be spoken about.
Yeah, if somebody comes out to you, remember they are trusting you. Coming out is a exercise in trust between people who both are and are not something. Specifically, in my case, it'd be non-binary and bisexual. And so if I come out to somebody, they know exactly what I am because I'm trusting them. And so invalidating that identity is a breach of trust, which is not fun to do. And we actually have time for just one more question, which is, what should someone do if they hear someone in the LGBTQ plus community making fun of or making comments about another part of the LGBTQ plus community? I'm going to quickly handle this because we do only have about 30 seconds. So sorry, Aviva. This one's a bit more difficult because, like any community where it's a broad, overarching title that has a lot of subsections and subcultures, it can get very dicey. For example, some gay men might make jokes about lesbians, some lesbians might make jokes about gay men. Depending on the context, depending if that group is present, and that is the bell, so I'm going to try and make this very brief. Depending on if the group is present and depending on their interpretation and their feelings about the actual statements, sometimes you don't have to do anything. Sometimes it's all in good fun. Typically, use best judgment. If it's said with malicious intent and not sort of making fun of yourself and making fun of something that can apply to a whole bunch of people, that's typically when you should probably step in and say, hey, maybe don't make fun of trans people if you're a cisgendered white queer person, or don't make fun of black trans people or black queer people because as a white person you don't have that ability. It's very much using best judgment and being able to say, this is what I'm trying to say, this is poking fun at myself and other people rather than I am deliberately making fun of somebody else. That concludes our presentation today. Thank you all so very much for coming. If you guys would all head to... All right, E-Block is next. So we do have a panel next block for queer people of color. If you guys have free E-Blocks, come on down. If not, enjoy the rest of your day.